A wealthy politician dismissed a crying child begging for help. What Pablo Escobar did next changed how an entire city understood power. Medellín, 1985. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, turning the barrio streets into muddy rivers that carried away what little hope the poor families had left. In the hills above the city, where mansions gleamed white against the green mountains, Councilman Eduardo Vargas was hosting another dinner party for Colombia's political elite. Eduardo had just been re-elected on promises to help the working class. His campaign posters still hung on poles throughout the city. Vargas cares for every Colombian. But tonight, like most nights, he was more concerned with impressing the oil executives and foreign investors who could fund his next campaign. The party was in full swing when the doorbell rang. Eduardo's butler answered, expecting perhaps a late-arriving guest or a delivery. Instead, he found a small boy, maybe 8 years old, soaked through from the rain, shivering in clothes that were too big for him. "Please," the boy said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I need to see Senor Vargas. My mother is dying." The butler looked past the child to the pristine white marble of the foyer, imagining muddy footprints on the expensive tile. "The councilman is busy. You should go to the hospital." "We tried the hospital," the boy said, tears mixing with the rainwater on his face. "They said we need money first. My mama needs medicine. The doctor said without it, she will die tonight." The butler hesitated. He could hear laughter and music from the dining room, could smell the expensive wine and imported food. This wasn't the time or place for charity cases. "How much?" the butler asked. 200,000 pesos, the boy said, "for the medicine and the operation. Please, I know Senor Vargas helps people. His posters say so." 200,000 pesos, less than what Eduardo had spent on wine for tonight's dinner. The butler glanced toward the dining room, where Colombia's power brokers were discussing million-dollar contracts over dessert. "Wait here," the butler said, closing the door. In the dining room, Eduardo was telling a story about his latest political victory, gesturing with a glass of French champagne that cost more than most families in Medellín earned in a month. The butler approached quietly. "Councilman," he whispered, "there's a child at the door. Says his mother is dying and needs medicine money." Eduardo didn't break his conversation. "Handle it," he said without looking away from his guests. "Give him some coins and send him away." "Sir, he says she needs 200,000 pesos for an operation." Now Eduardo turned, his expression hardening. 200,000? What do I look like, a bank? Tell him to go to charity. That's what charity is for." He turned back to his guests. "Sorry about that. Where was I?" The butler returned to the door where the boy waited, still dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. The 8-year-old looked up with eyes that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty, but still held a spark of hope. "I'm sorry," the butler said. "The councilman is very busy tonight. Perhaps you could try the church, or—" "But his posters," the boy interrupted. "They say he cares for every Colombian. I am Colombian. My mama's Colombian." The butler's face softened for a moment. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a few bills. Maybe enough for a meal, but nowhere near enough for medicine. "This is all I can do. I'm sorry." The boy took the money but didn't leave. "Can I just talk to him? Just for 1 minute? I'll tell him about my mama. Maybe if he knows about her, he'll help." From inside, they could hear Eduardo's booming laugh at his own joke. The butler shook his head. "He won't see you, child. Go home. Take care of your mother as best you can." The boy stood there for a long moment, rain soaking through his thin shirt, staring at the door that had just closed on his mother's life. Then he turned and walked back into the night, carrying nothing but a handful of coins, and the knowledge that the words on political posters meant nothing when the man behind them was too busy dining with the wealthy to save a dying woman. What the boy didn't know, what nobody at that party knew, was that someone had been watching. Someone who understood what it felt like to be poor and desperate, to have doors slammed in your face by people who promised to help. Pablo Escobar had been driving through the neighborhood when he saw the small figure trudging through the rain away from the mansion. Pablo had grown up in these same hills, had knocked on similar doors as a child, had felt the same crushing disappointment when powerful people turned away. He pulled over and rolled down his window. "Hey, kid!" The boy looked up, scared. In Medellín, when strangers called to you from cars at night, it usually meant trouble. "What were you doing at that house?" Pablo asked, his voice gentle. The boy hesitated, then seemed to collapse inward. Maybe it didn't matter who this stranger was. Maybe telling someone, anyone, would help. My mama's dying. The doctor said she needs medicine and an operation. 200,000 pesos. I asked the councilman for help, but he was too busy. Pablo sat quietly for a moment, rain drumming on the roof of his car. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a roll of bills. He peeled off several and handed them through the window. Take this to the hospital, Pablo said. Tell them Pablo sent you. Plus, tell them to take care of your mother, and if they need more money, they should call me. The boy stared at the money in his hands. It was more than 200,000 pesos. It was enough for the operation, the medicine, and months of recovery care. Who are you? The boy whispered. Pablo smiled, but there was no joy in it, only recognition of a pain he knew too well. Someone who remembers what it feels like to need help. The boy ran toward the hospital, clutching the money, hope restored to his young heart. Pablo sat in his car for a few more minutes, looking up at the mansion where Eduardo Vargas was still entertaining his guests, completely unaware that he had just made a very serious mistake. 3 days later, construction trucks arrived at the empty lot across from Eduardo Vargas's house. The workers moved quickly and quietly, laying foundation and erecting walls with the efficiency that came from unlimited funding and a sense of urgent purpose. Eduardo watched from his window, annoyed by the noise, but assuming someone was building another mansion for one of his wealthy neighbors. The construction would probably take months, he thought, but eventually it would increase his property values. He was wrong about the timeline. Within a week, the structure was complete. Not a mansion, but something the neighborhood had never seen. A medical clinic. Small but perfectly equipped, with modern equipment, and a pharmacy stocked with medicines most families in Medellín could never afford. A simple sign went up front: free medical care for all. Eduardo stared at the sign through his window, a cold feeling growing in his stomach. Free medical care. In his neighborhood. Making his campaign promises look like lies by comparison. But what really unsettled him was what happened next. Every morning, a line of people formed outside the clinic. Poor families from the barrios, mothers carrying sick children, elderly people who hadn't seen a doctor in years because they couldn't afford it. They came from all over Medellín, drawn by word of mouth that spread faster than any political campaign. The clinic operated with quiet efficiency. No speeches, no ribbon cuttings, no politicians posing for photos with patients. Just doctors and nurses providing medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. Eduardo tried to find out who was funding it. He made calls to his contacts in city government, to his friends in business, to anyone who might know something. The answers he got were vague and unhelpful. Private funding. Anonymous donor. Better not to ask too many questions. That last response made Eduardo's blood run cold. 2 weeks after the clinic opened, Eduardo received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the clinic's opening, and written in neat handwriting across the top. This is what caring for every Colombian looks like. A friend. Eduardo's hands shook as he read the note. He understood the message perfectly. Someone knew about the night he had turned away the dying woman's son. Someone had built an entire medical clinic to make a point about his failure to help a child who believed the words on his campaign posters. But who? And more importantly, what did they want? The answer came the next morning. Eduardo was having breakfast when his butler approached with a worried expression. "Councilman, there's someone here to see you. He says it's about the clinic." Eduardo's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. "Send him in." The man who entered was not what Eduardo had expected. Short, stocky, with a mustache and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He wore simple clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, nothing that marked him as wealthy or powerful. But something about his presence filled the room, made Eduardo feel like a small man in his own house. "Councilman Vargas," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Pablo." Eduardo shook the offered hand, his own palms sweaty with fear. "Pablo? Just Pablo." The man sat down without being invited, completely at ease. "I wanted to talk to you about the clinic." "Are you the one who built it?" Eduardo asked, though he already knew the answer. Pablo nodded. "Beautiful facility, don't you think? The doctors tell me they're seeing about 100 patients a day. Families who couldn't afford medical care before, children who were sick, mothers who were suffering, all getting treatment now. Eduardo swallowed hard. It's, very generous. Generosity. Pablo repeated the word thoughtfully. That's an interesting concept. Tell me, councilman, what do you think generosity means? The question hung in the air like smoke. Eduardo felt like he was walking through a minefield, every word potentially explosive. Helping others, Eduardo said carefully. Using your resources to make life better for people who have less. Pablo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what I thought too. But then I heard about this child, maybe 8 years old, who walked through the rain to ask for help. His mother was dying, and he believed that someone who promised to care for every Colombian would actually do it. Eduardo's mouth went dry. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do, Pablo said quietly. You were having a party that night. French champagne, imported food, very fancy. And this boy showed up at your door, soaking wet, begging for 200,000 pesos to save his mother's life. The room seemed to shrink around Eduardo. Look, I get dozens of people asking for money. I can't help everyone. I have to be practical about these things. Pablo leaned forward slightly. 200,000 pesos. Do you know how much you spent on wine that night? Eduardo didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the number. The boy's mother lived, Pablo continued. The operation was successful. She's working again, taking care of her family. The boy goes to school now, gets good grades. He wants to be a doctor when he grows up, so he can help other families like his. That's wonderful, Eduardo stammered. Pablo stood up, straightening his shirt. He still has your campaign poster on his bedroom wall. Vargas cares for every Colombian. He told me he wants to believe that's true. The words hit Eduardo like physical blows. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about political power or business deals. This was about a child who had believed in the promise of help and been turned away. What do you want from me? Eduardo asked. Pablo walked to the window and looked out at the clinic, where the morning line of patients was already forming. I don't want anything from you, councilman. I wanted to give you something. Give me what? Pablo turned back to him, and for the first time, there was something almost sad in his expression. A chance to understand what your words mean. That boy taught me something that night. He taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply care when someone asks for help. Pablo moved toward the door, then paused. The clinic will stay open as long as it's needed. Every patient who comes there, every mother who doesn't have to watch her child suffer, every family who gets medical care they couldn't afford, they're all reminders of what you could have done with 200,000 pesos. After Pablo left, Eduardo sat alone in his breakfast room, staring out at the clinic where dozens of people waited patiently for medical care they never could have afforded before. The morning sun reflected off the building's white walls, creating a brightness that made his eyes water. Over the following months, Eduardo found himself watching the clinic obsessively. He saw mothers carrying babies, elderly men supporting each other as they walked, children holding their parents' hands as they waited in line, all of them receiving care that cost them nothing, from a facility that had appeared overnight like an answer to prayers they hadn't dared to pray. The breaking point came 3 months later, at another dinner party celebrating Eduardo's potential mayoral campaign. The same wealthy friends, the same expensive wine, the same conversations about money and power. Eduardo, one of his guests said, raising a glass of champagne, "You've really changed this neighborhood. That clinic has brought so much positive attention to the area. Very smart politically." The other guests murmured agreement. They assumed he was responsible for the clinic, that it was a brilliant campaign strategy to demonstrate his commitment to helping the poor. Eduardo stared at his champagne glass, watching bubbles rise to the surface and disappear. "I didn't build the clinic," he said quietly. The conversation stopped. "What?" someone asked. "I didn't build it," Eduardo repeated, louder now. "Someone else did. Someone who understood what it actually means to care for every Colombian." His guests exchanged glances, confused by his tone. This wasn't the confident politician they knew. "Then who did build it?" another guest asked. Eduardo set down his glass and looked around the table at the faces of Colombia's power elite. Someone better than me, Eduardo said. Years passed. Eduardo never ran for mayor. He served out his term as councilman quietly, without the fanfare and empty promises that had characterized his earlier career. He visited the clinic sometimes, not as a politician seeking photo opportunities, but as a man trying to understand something that had been shown to him. The boy whose mother had been saved grew up to be a doctor, just as he dreamed. He worked at the clinic, treating patients who reminded him of his own family struggle. He never knew that the man who had turned him away that rainy night sometimes sat in the waiting room, watching him work. In 2018, 33 years after the clinic opened, Eduardo Vargas gave his final interview as a public figure. The journalist asked him about his legacy, about what he was most proud of in his political career. Eduardo thought for a long time before answering. There was a night in 1985 when a child came to my door asking for help. I was having a party, drinking expensive wine, impressing wealthy friends. I sent him away. The journalist waited for more, but Eduardo seemed lost in the memory. "That's it?" the journalist finally asked. "That's what you want to be remembered for?" Eduardo looked out the window toward the hills where the clinic still operated, still treating patients who couldn't afford medical care anywhere else. "I want to be remembered for learning something," Eduardo said. "I want to be remembered for understanding, eventually, that when a child believes your promises enough to walk through the rain and knock on your door, turning him away doesn't make you practical. It makes you a failure as a human being." The clinic still operates today, 38 years after it opened. It has expanded several times, adding specialists and new equipment, treating thousands of families who might otherwise have gone without medical care. No one has ever officially claimed credit for founding it, but in the barrio where Pablo Escobar grew up, where children still knock on doors asking for help, people tell a different version of the story. They tell it to their children and grandchildren, not as a tale about politics or power, but as something simpler and more important. They tell them about what happens when someone who remembers being powerless finds the strength to make sure others don't have to stay that way. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't violence or revenge. Sometimes it's simply caring when someone asks for help. Pablo Escobar never spoke publicly about the clinic, but every morning for years until his death in 1993, he would drive past it on his way to other business, watching the line of patients waiting for care, remembering what it felt like to be the child no one would help. The boy who had knocked on Eduardo Vargas's door that rainy night never learned the full story of what had happened after he walked away. But sometimes when he finished treating a patient who couldn't afford care anywhere else, he would look up at the hills where the mansions gleamed white against the mountains and remember what it felt like to believe that someone might help. And that memory was enough to remind him why he had become a doctor in the first place,